The crystal glass in my hand felt heavy, yet it was nothing compared to the weight of my daughter-in-law's whisper against my ear. Amidst the jazz and polite applause for my son, she smiled sweetly and told me to pack up and leave my own home tonight. She saw a frail, 72-year-old woman in a stiff dress, unaware that I secretly owned the very empire she was trying to steal. My name is Margaret Holt. I am 72 years old, a white widow who has spent the better part of her life in a weather-beaten two-story house in the working-class outskirts of Riverton, Ohio. My hands are rough from decades of woodworking and labor, and my face carries the map of a life spent worrying about bills and making ends meet. Tonight, however, I was far from my comfortable, drafty porch. I stood in the ballroom of the Grand Riverton Hotel, a place where the crystal chandeliers seemed to mock the sensible heels I had polished just this morning. I was here for my son, but I felt like an intruder in a world painted in gold and arrogance. The atmosphere was suffocatingly rich. The air smelled of expensive cologne and roasted duck, layered over the smooth, hypnotic rhythm of a live jazz band. Around me, men in sharp suits and women in silk gowns clinked glasses, their laughter sounding like wind chimes. They looked at me with polite confusion. I could see it in their eyes as they scanned my navy blue dress, which I had ironed so enthusiastically that the fabric stood stiff and awkward against my skin. To them, I was just the country mother, a quaint accessory to the evening's main event. My son, Daniel, was the reason for this gathering. At 42, he looked the picture of health and success. He stood on the raised stage, bathed in a spotlight that made him look larger than life. The CEO of Northbridge Dynamics introduced him as the new vice president, calling him a rising star who had climbed his way up from the factory floor. When Daniel finally stepped down, he found me in the crowd. He pulled me into a hug that smelled of starch and ambition, whispering into my hair that he had finally made it. I smiled and patted his back, feeling a surge of warmth, yet beneath it lay a vague, fluttering anxiety I could not quite name. Then there was Lydia. My daughter-in-law shimmered in a silver dress that clung to her body like a second skin, far too extravagant for a family celebration, but perfect for marking territory. She stayed glued to Daniel's side, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Her smiles were bright for the cameras and the board members, but whenever her gaze flickered toward me, the warmth evaporated instantly. I watched her snap her fingers at a passing waiter for a refill without even glancing at his face, and then check her diamond watch with a sharp, impatient flick of her wrist. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a cold, hard stone. After the speeches concluded and the music swelled again, Lydia detached herself from Daniel and took my arm. Her grip was firm, her nails digging slightly into my sleeve. She guided me away from the warmth of the ballroom toward the service corridor behind the stage. The air here was different, chilled by the aggressive hum of the industrial air conditioning units, and the lighting was dim and grey. Lydia dropped the facade immediately. She reached into her clutch and produced a rigid envelope, thrusting it into my hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a deed transfer, granting full ownership of my home in Riverton to her. At the bottom was a signature that looked remarkably like Daniel's, though perhaps a bit too perfect. She spoke smoothly, her voice devoid of any familial affection. She told me that starting next month, I would no longer be living there. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of champagne, and whispered the words that would haunt me. "Pack up and get out." She said it with a cruel intimacy, adding that if I was not gone by the deadline, she would call the police to have me removed as a trespasser. The humiliation washed over me. On the night my only child reached the pinnacle of his career, his wife was evicting me from the home my husband and I had built with our own hands. I stood frozen. My eyes welled with tears, and my hands trembled as I clutched the paper. To Lydia, I looked like a shattered old woman, defenseless and pathetic. That was exactly what she wanted to see. But beneath the trembling, something shifted. The shock did not break me. It calcified. A block of ice formed in my chest, turning my shame into a cold, silent danger. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned and walked back toward the ballroom entrance. Through the open doors, I saw Daniel laughing with a group of investors, completely unaware of the brutality that had just taken place a few feet away. I decided not to ruin his night. Instead, I turned toward the exit, stepping out into the biting night wind in my thin coat. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the hotel, I saw Lydia one last time. She was raising a flute of champagne, laughing with the management team, confident she had defeated a poor, helpless widow. She had no idea. As I walked toward the parking lot, I began to mentally count down. She thought the war was over, but I knew it had only just begun. The house on Maple Terrace was silent when I returned, but it was a silence that I knew by heart. I ran my hand along the banister as I walked up the porch steps. It was solid oak, sanded down by my own hands nearly 40 years ago. To Lydia, this place was just a drafty old building on a piece of land she wanted to liquidate. She did not know that my husband and I had built it ourselves, measuring every beam and laying every floorboard in the evenings after our shifts ended. It was not just an asset on a spreadsheet. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of sweat. I allowed myself a moment of nostalgia as I hung my coat on the rack. I thought back to those early days when I was just a carpenter's assistant and my husband was a factory line worker. We scraped together every penny to open Holt cabinetry. We made custom kitchen units for the affordable housing projects springing up around Riverton. We were never rich, or at least we did not act like it. But we were smart. Years ago, we sold a portion of our workshop space to a young, ambitious investor who needed a garage for his computer hardware experiments. That young man went on to co-found Northbridge Dynamics. We took payment in equity rather than cash, a decision that quietly made us silent shareholders in the very giant my son now helped run. When my husband died in an industrial accident 22 years ago, I was 50. I could have collapsed under the grief. Instead, I learned to read contracts. I realized that to protect Daniel, I had to understand the language of wolves. That was when I met Caroline Ruiz. She was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney of Latin American descent, barely 40 at the time, but with a mind like a steel trap. Together, we created the Holt Family Trust. We moved everything, including this house and the Northbridge shares, into the trust more than 10 years ago. Technically, I owned nothing. Daniel owned nothing. The trust owned it all, and I was the sole beneficiary. I made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, thinking about my son. Daniel was a good man. He was hard-working and brilliant with logistics, but he had a fatal flaw. He was soft when it came to the people he loved. He had dated pragmatic women before, but none of them frightened me until he brought Lydia home. I remembered their first dinner at this very table. Lydia had not asked about Daniel's childhood or our family history. Her questions were surgical. She wanted to know about vesting schedules, stock options, and executive bonuses. When Daniel mentioned that the house was part of a family trust, I saw her eyes narrow, just for a fraction of a second. She had looked at the peeling wallpaper and assumed the trust was a way to manage debt, not wealth. Over the last 2 years, I had watched her lease luxury cars and take vacations with friends she called influencers. Daniel always laughed it off, saying his wife made her own money online. I knew better. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope Lydia had thrust into my hands at the hotel. I smoothed the deed transfer out on the wooden table. The document claimed that Daniel had signed the house over to her. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was written in thick black ink. It looked like Daniel's name, but the rhythm was wrong. Daniel signed his name with a sharp, hurried slant, a habit from signing hundreds of shipping manifests. This signature was round and careful. It was the work of someone trying too hard to be perfect. I did not cry. The tears I had shed in the hotel lobby were the last she would ever get from me. I picked up my old address book and found the number I had not used in a year. It was past midnight, but I knew she would be awake. I dialed. The line rang twice before a crisp, alert voice answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked down at the forged signature and spoke clearly into the receiver. "Caroline," I said. "Tomorrow morning. We start." The morning light hit the steel and glass facade of Ruiz and Clark Attorneys with a blinding intensity. But inside, the air was cool and sterile. I walked past the receptionist without stopping and pushed open the door to Caroline's office. She was sitting behind her desk in a sharp grey suit, reviewing a stack of files. She did not offer me coffee or ask about the party. She took one look at my pale, drawn face and immediately closed the folder she was reading. I placed the envelope on her mahogany desk. My hands were steadier than they had been the night before. But only just. Caroline slid the document out. She scanned the names, the dates, and the notarization stamp. Her jaw tightened, and I heard the grinding of her teeth. She looked up, her dark eyes furious. She asked me if Daniel had ever mentioned using the house as collateral or gifting it to his wife. I shook my head and told her never. Caroline spun her chair around and pulled a thick binder from the shelf behind her. It was labelled Holt Family Trust. She opened it to the property deed section. She pointed to the documents. The house on Maple Terrace had been titled to the trust for more than 12 years. I was the beneficiary. Caroline was the trustee. There was no power of attorney granted to Daniel. He could not have transferred that house even if he wanted to. Then, Caroline did something that made the room feel very small. She turned to her computer and opened a secure email folder. She told me to look at the screen. Dated exactly 1 week ago, there was an email from Daniel. Attached was a scan of a document that looked nearly identical to the one I had just handed her. The message was short. He asked Caroline what the document was, because Lydia had told him it was just a minor formality for the bank. Caroline explained that she had tried to call him immediately, but he texted back, saying he was tied up in urgent meetings with the board of directors. He had promised to come see her right after his promotion party to sort it out. That meeting never happened. We sat in silence for a few seconds, the realization settling between us like dust. Daniel had been suspicious. He had been half believing, half doubting, but he had been too busy to confirm it. Lydia had used that window of time to strike. Caroline picked up her office phone. She dialed a forensic handwriting expert and told him she was sending over the scan Daniel had emailed, along with his old employment contracts and car loan documents for comparison. At the same time, she began drafting a formal complaint to the Riverton Police Department regarding suspected forgery and fraud. Just as she was typing the header of the complaint, my cell phone vibrated against the wood of the desk. The screen flashed Lydia's name. I answered. Before I could say a word, a wail pierced my ear. Lydia was sobbing, her voice jagged and hysterical. She told me Daniel had just collapsed at his office. She said he was gone. Massive stroke. The world tilted. I felt the blood drain from my head, and I swayed dangerously in the chair. Caroline was around her desk in a second, her hands gripping my shoulders to keep me upright. The grief hit me like a physical blow, a tidal wave of darkness. But through the receiver, Lydia kept talking. She cried that he had been so stressed lately. She said he was worried sick about me and about money. The words snagged in my mind. Stressed about me. Stressed about money. Daniel had just been promoted. He had no debts that I knew of. I ended the call without saying goodbye. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. In the distance, the glass tower of Northbridge Dynamics rose into the skyline. As I watched, I saw a tiny white banner being unfurled from the upper floors, a sign of mourning. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. My son was dead. If it was nature, if it was God's will, I would find a way to accept it. But Lydia's story did not fit. The forgery did not fit. The timing did not fit. I stared at the building and made a silent promise. If this was not natural, I would turn this entire city upside down until I found the truth. The funeral service was held at the small brick church on the corner of Elm and 4th, the same place Daniel had been baptized 42 years ago. The pews were packed shoulder to shoulder. Colleagues from Northbridge Dynamics stood awkwardly in their Italian suits next to retired factory workers in flannel shirts. Everyone wanted to pay their respects to the local boy who had made something of himself, the success story that gave this tired neighborhood a reason to hope. I walked up to the open casket. My legs felt unsteady, but not from age. I placed my hand on the polished mahogany lid. It was cold and smooth. Nothing like the rough, sawdust-covered wood Daniel used to play with in our workshop when he was a toddler. Looking at his face, peaceful and pale, the question hammered inside my skull. Why did a healthy man, a man who jogged 5 miles a week and had just passed a corporate physical, drop dead minutes after the biggest celebration of his life? Lydia stood a few feet away. She was dressed in head-to-toe black designer silk, wearing sunglasses large enough to hide half her face. She did not look at Daniel. She did not hold my hand. Instead, she was glued to her phone. Through the dark lenses of her glasses, I saw the reflection of the screen. She was texting rapidly, her thumbs moving in a blur. At one point, I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward, a fleeting, secret smile directed at whatever message she had just received. It vanished the moment she sensed someone looking, replaced instantly by a mask of tragic stoicism. After the burial, the mourners retreated to my house on Maple Terrace. The kitchen counters disappeared under aluminum trays of lasagna, tuna casseroles, and bucket after bucket of fried chicken brought by the neighbors. People patted my shoulder and told stories about Daniel. Mrs. Gable from next door reminded me of the time Daniel fixed her roof after a storm for free, back when he was just 18. I nodded and thanked them, playing the part of the grieving mother, while my eyes kept drifting to Lydia. When the last guest finally left, the silence that fell over the house was heavy. Lydia did not offer to help clean up. Instead, she went upstairs and changed out of her funeral attire. She came back down wearing tight jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking bizarrely relieved, as if she had just finished a boring shift at work. She leaned against the counter and told me that it was just the two of us now, and she would take care of everything. The way she said it sounded less like a promise and more like a command. She walked over to the sideboard where I kept my important papers and pulled out the original deed transfer. She must have planted it there, or perhaps she had been carrying it, waiting for the audience to leave. She slapped it onto the dining table. She told me Daniel had gifted the house to her to secure the future for their children, ignoring the fact that they had never had any. Then she looked me in the eye and said I had 30 days to vacate the premises. I decided to give her the performance she expected. I let my hands shake visibly. I forced my eyes to redden and filled my voice with tremors. I asked her over and over again when he had signed this. I asked if he knew what he was doing. Lydia grew impatient. She snapped at me, saying he signed it 6 weeks ago, back when he still trusted her. 6 weeks. The number rang a bell. It matched the timeline Caroline and I had discussed. It was the exact period Daniel had started asking questions. I lowered my head and whispered that I understood. I accepted the 30 days. Lydia smirked, satisfied that the old woman was defeated. But the moment she went upstairs to bed, I locked the bathroom door and called Caroline. I told her everything. Caroline moved immediately, filing an emergency petition with the police regarding suspected forgery and asset misappropriation, specifically requesting a freeze on any transaction involving the property. The next morning, the house was quiet until I heard Lydia's voice from the living room. She was on the phone, her tone bright and professional. She was speaking to an agent from Lakeview Premier Realty, listing the house for an immediate cash sale. I could hear the excitement in her voice as she described the square footage, clearly already mentally spending the money on a downtown penthouse. Then came the knock at the door. It was not a polite tap. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that rattled the picture frames in the hallway. Lydia froze. She lowered the phone, annoyance crossing her face as if a delivery person had interrupted her. She pulled the door open, expecting a neighbor. 2 officers from the Riverton Police Department stood on the porch. The older one stepped forward and asked for Mrs. Lydia Holt. He stated clearly that they were there to clarify a filed complaint regarding fraud and the unauthorized appropriation of assets belonging to the Holt family trust. For the first time since Daniel died, the color drained completely from Lydia's face. She dropped her phone. It hit the wooden floor with a crack, the voice of the real estate agent still buzzing tinny and small from the receiver. I stood in the kitchen doorway, sipping my coffee, and watched the fear finally arrive. The conference room at Ruiz and Clark was designed to intimidate, perched high above the city with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a panoramic view of Riverton. At the long mahogany table, the battle lines were drawn. On one side sat Lydia and her lawyer, Evan Carr. Evan was a young man in a shiny, ill-fitting suit who clearly thought he was about to steamroll a confused old woman. He had the arrogant posture of someone who had never been told no, and he looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Evan opened his briefcase and launched into a script I suspected he had used a dozen times before. He leaned forward, clasping his hands, and began to lecture us. He accused me of harassing a grieving widow during her most vulnerable moment. He claimed that Lydia was the sole and legal owner of the property based on the deed transfer in her possession. He even went so far as to threaten a countersuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress if I did not drop my claims immediately. His voice was loud, filling the room with legal buzzwords intended to scare me into submission. I sat, perfectly still. I did not fidget. I did not interrupt. And I certainly did not look scared. I just watched him. His words slid off me like rain on a tin roof. The more he spoke, the more I noticed Caroline smiling. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, sharp expression of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. Evan seemed to sense the shift in the air because his confident monologue began to falter. He stopped mid-sentence, frowning at Caroline's silence. Without saying a word, Caroline opened a folder and slid a single document across the polished wood. It was the report from the forensic handwriting analyst. She explained calmly that the analysis revealed significant discrepancies in the signature. There were clear signs of hesitation, irregular pen pressure, and microscopic tracing marks that indicated the signature had been drawn, not written. The expert concluded it was an amateur forgery, likely created by tracing over a genuine signature from another document. Evans scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He declared that his client could easily find her own expert to dispute those findings. Caroline leaned back in her leather chair. She told him that he was welcome to try, but it would not matter. She said that even if the signature were 100% authentic, the piece of paper Lydia held was still completely worthless. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Caroline placed a thick, bound document on the table. The cover read, Holt Family Trust. She opened it to the schedule of assets. She explained that the house on Maple Terrace, along with 17 other properties, was not owned by Daniel or myself. They had been the property of the trust for over a decade. As the sole trustee, only Caroline had the legal authority to transfer or sell them. Daniel had absolutely no power to gift the house to anyone. Lydia's mouth fell open. For the first time, her composure cracked. She stared at the document as if it were written in an alien language. She had assumed that because Daniel grew up in that house, it belonged to him personally. Beside her, Evan was frantically flipping through the pages of the trust document, his face flushing red. He realized he had made a rookie mistake. He had never bothered to check the county clerk's records for the property title. Caroline did not let up. She continued to list the assets held by the trust. There were several apartment blocks in the city, 3 industrial warehouses, and the land upon which the Northbridge Dynamics headquarters was built. She stated the total estimated value of the trust was over $18 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Lydia looked like she had been struck by lightning. She had been fighting for a drafty old house, completely unaware of the empire she had been sitting next to. I spoke for the first time. My voice was quiet but steady. I told them that Daniel knew every detail of this structure. I told them he had sat in this very room and learned how to manage these assets. He knew he could not sign that house over to her. He would never have signed a document he knew was void. Caroline closed the folder with a sharp snap. She looked directly at Lydia, her eyes hard. She told Lydia that she clearly had no idea who she had married. She thought she had snagged a manager with a decent stock portfolio. In reality, she had married the heir to a fortune. And now, Caroline said, her voice dropping to a whisper, that heir was dead in a very convenient manner. For the first time, the look on Lydia's face was not just greed or anger, it was pure, unadulterated fear. She realized the game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than she could have ever imagined. Caroline introduced me to Jonah Pierce 2 days later. He did not look like the kind of man who handled million-dollar cases. He was a former FBI agent in his 50s, built like a refrigerator, wearing a suit that looked like it had spent the night on the floor. He had a thick neck and hands that looked heavy enough to crush a brick, but his eyes were the part that mattered. They were sharp, restless, and completely devoid of warmth. Caroline told me he specialized in financial crimes and what she politely called suspicious accidents for high-net-worth clients. We met at a diner 3 blocks from my house, the kind of place where the coffee costs $1 and tastes like burnt rubber. It was a fitting setting for my life, but it felt strange to discuss an $18 million estate while sitting on vinyl seats patched with silver duct tape. Jonah did not seem to mind. He did not waste time with small talk. He took out a notepad and asked me to tell him everything about Lydia. He wanted to know her habits, her friends, and exactly how she spent her days. I told him what little I knew, which mostly involved her shopping trips and her vague career as an influencer. Jonah started his report by dismantling the lie Lydia had told the police and the press. She had claimed Daniel was drowning in debt due to bad investments. Jonah tapped his tablet and spun it around so I could see. He had pulled Daniel's credit report and bank statements. They were immaculate. My son had a credit score near 800 and zero balance on his credit cards. He was not the gambler in the family. Then Jonah swiped the screen to show a different set of records. He had tracked the IP addresses used at Daniel's home and cross-referenced them with digital wallets registered in Lydia's maiden name. The screen was a sea of red. There were dozens of transactions to offshore crypto casinos and sports betting apps. There was even a predatory lending app disguised as a payday loan service. The numbers were staggering. Jonah estimated she owed close to $200,000. Most of that was compounding interest. He showed me screenshots of text messages sent to a burner phone linked to her. They were from a user named Hawkline Capital. Jonah explained that this was not a legitimate financial institution. It was a front for a loan shark ring operating out of the neighboring state. The messages were graphic and violent, demanding payment by the end of the month or else. Then came the physical evidence. Jonah had pulled security footage from the underground parking garage at Northbridge Dynamics. The video was time-stamped for the night of the promotion party. The image was grainy, but the shapes were clear enough. Daniel and Lydia were sitting in his car before they went up to the ballroom. They were not celebrating, they were fighting. I watched my son gesture wildly, something he rarely did. Then, he reached into the back seat, grabbed a thick stack of papers, and threw them at her. Jonah zoomed in on the freeze frame. The papers had the distinct blue backing of formal court documents. Caroline squinted at the image and made a call to a contact she had at the courthouse. She suspected she knew exactly what they were. Jonah drove us to a firm called Marsh and Tate Family Law later that afternoon. The partners there confirmed everything. Daniel had visited them twice in the last week. He had signed a petition for divorce and updated his will. He had told the attorneys that he planned to serve Lydia with the papers immediately after the promotion party, once the public obligations were over. Since Daniel was deceased, the attorney allowed us to view the file. I read the copy with shaking hands. Daniel had cut her out completely. Every stock option, every savings account, and his life insurance policy were designated for me and a new engineering scholarship fund he wanted to start. Lydia was set to receive absolutely nothing. Jonah sat back and folded his arms. He said it was clear what happened. That night in the car, Daniel handed her the divorce papers and the new will. He told her the game was over. I looked at the footage again, watching the silent argument play out. That was the moment. That was when Lydia realized she was not just losing a husband. She was losing her lifeline to the money she needed to pay off the sharks. She went from being a greedy woman to a desperate one. And as Jonah pointed out, desperate people are the most dangerous kind. The initial death certificate had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency and medical oversight. The attending physician at the emergency room had ruled Daniel's death a massive hemorrhagic stroke brought on by acute stress. They had relied heavily on the medical history provided by the grieving widow. Lydia had told them Daniel suffered from severe anxiety and high blood pressure, painting a picture of a man ticking like a time bomb. Because there were no external wounds and the cause seemed natural for a stressed executive, no one had requested a toxicology screen. They simply closed the file and sent him to the funeral home. Jonah and Caroline refused to let that stand. They filed a formal petition with the state medical examiner's office demanding an exhumation and a full autopsy. The petition was thick with evidence of financial motive. It listed the gambling debts, the pending divorce, the secret new will, and the forged property deed. The sheer volume of suspicious circumstances forced the state to act. They could not ignore the possibility that a crime had been buried 6 feet under. I had to sign the paperwork to bring my son back up. Standing at the gravesite on a freezing Tuesday morning was the hardest thing I have ever done. I watched the machinery tear up the fresh earth. I watched them hoist the mahogany casket back into the light. When they opened the lid to verify the identity, I saw the white body bag and felt a ripping sensation in my chest, as if my own heart were being extracted. But I picked up the pen and signed the authorization. My hand did not shake. If my son had been murdered, I had to know. Dr. Rosen was the chief medical examiner. She was a woman of about 60, with short grey hair and a manner that was completely devoid of bedside manner. She met us in her office after the procedure. She did not offer condolences. She simply laid out the toxicology report on her metal desk. She told us that the blood and tissue samples revealed lethal concentrations of digitoxin and a powerful anticoagulant. The levels were far beyond any therapeutic dose. She explained that digitoxin is a heart medication used to treat heart failure, but in high doses, it causes the heart to beat irregularly. Combined with the blood thinners, it created a recipe for disaster. The thinners weakened the walls of his blood vessels, while the heart drug spiked his blood pressure. It was a biological demolition. Dr. Rosen pointed to a section of the report analysing the stomach contents. The poison had not been administered all at once. It had been introduced systematically over several weeks. The residue found in his digestive tract suggested the delivery vehicle was a thick, viscous liquid. It matched the chemical profile of the whey protein shakes Daniel drank every morning before the gym. I remembered Lydia bragging to the neighbours about how she made his shakes for him every day because she wanted him to stay healthy. The doctor described the progression of his death, and her words made me sick. She said Daniel would have felt dizzy and nauseous for days. He would have had blinding headaches and blurred vision. The collapse at his office was just the final structural failure after weeks of being poisoned from the inside out. It was not the quick, painless exit Lydia had described to the press. It was slow torture. Jonah leaned forward and asked the question that hung in the sterile air. He asked who prepared those shakes for him. The answer was so obvious it made the room feel colder. Lydia was the only one who touched his food. Dr. Rosen closed the file. She stated that the official cause of death was being amended to homicide by intentional poisoning, The findings were inconsistent with a natural stroke. She was forwarding the full file to the district attorney of Riverton immediately. I walked out to the parking lot and stood by Caroline's car. The winter sky was a flat, oppressive grey. I felt a bile rise in my throat, a mix of horror and rage so potent I wanted to scream until my lungs burst. But I swallowed it down. I looked at the asphalt and spoke quietly. He did not fall because of fate, I said. He was pushed. Caroline placed a firm hand on my shoulder. She looked me in the eye and told me that this was no longer a property dispute. We were now seeking justice for a murder. I nodded slowly. The tears that had threatened to spill earlier were gone, in their place. I felt something hard and cold settle behind my eyes. I had no more grief left to give. I only had steel. The rumours started as a whisper on a local blog, likely planted by that slimeball lawyer Evan Carr. The headline was catchy. Millionaire mother-in-law evicts grieving widow. By the next morning, the whisper had turned into a scream. I sat in my empty living room with the curtains drawn, watching the local news channel, Riverton Now. They had given Lydia the prime time slot. She looked nothing like the polished, arrogant woman who had handed me an eviction notice. She was wearing a soft, oatmeal-coloured sweater that made her look small and fragile. Her face was bare of makeup, leaving her skin looking pale and washed out. She held a tissue in her hand, twisting it nervously as the host leaned in with sympathetic eyes. Lydia spun a tale that would have made a fiction writer jealous. She spoke of a paranoid, greedy father-in-law who never accepted her because she came from the middle class. She wiped a tear and said Daniel had always told her about his poverty-stricken childhood. She claimed he had spent his entire adult life supporting his stubborn, ungrateful mother. I gripped the armrest of my chair until my knuckles turned white. The audacity was breathtaking. I was the one who had built the trust. I was the one who secured the shares. Yet to the world, I was the leech. She cried openly when she described the promotion party. She said it was the last time she saw her husband smile. She told the camera, her voice trembling, that Daniel collapsed because of the pressure. She blamed his job, and she blamed me. She said he was torn apart, trying to please a mother who was never satisfied. She conveniently forgot to mention the divorce papers he threw at her in the car, or the forged deed she tried to use to steal my home. The internet ate it up. Within hours. The hashtag Justice for Lydia was trending locally. The comments section was a cesspool. People I had never met called me a cold-blooded old hag and a greedy landlord. Someone posted my address. That night, I heard a heavy thud against the front door. When I looked out, I saw a bag of trash split open on my porch steps, garbage spilling onto the wood my husband had sanded by hand. I wanted to call the station. I wanted to scream the truth. But Caroline stopped me. She told me to let her talk. She said every word Lydia spoke was a nail in her own coffin because we had evidence that contradicted nearly everything she said. Jonah was already busy dismantling her performance. He sat at my dining table, comparing a transcript of the interview with the timeline we had built. Lydia claimed on air that Daniel had been complaining of headaches for months due to stress. But Jonah pointed out that Daniel's medical records showed 0 complaints of migraines until 3 weeks before he died, which was exactly when the poisoning began. She claimed they were happily planning a vacation to Europe. Jonah held up the divorce petition filed the same week. Then came the piece of evidence that changed everything. A female colleague of Daniel's contacted Caroline quietly. She had been afraid to come forward, but the news coverage made her sick. She sent us an audio file. It was a voice note Daniel had sent her a few weeks ago. We played it in the kitchen. Daniel's voice filled the room, low and serious. He said that if anything strange happened to him, people should know he did not do it to himself. He said he was scared of what was happening in his own house. That recording was the golden piece of the puzzle. I walked out to my porch later that evening. A car slowed down as it passed, and a teenager leaned out the window to shout my name, twisting it into something ugly he had learned from the television. I did not flinch. I just closed the door and turned the lock. Let them believe her for now. Let them rage. On the day of the trial, my silence would end, and the truth would be loud enough to shatter them all. The preliminary civil hearing regarding the dispute over the house on Maple Terrace took place in Courtroom 4 of the Riverton County Courthouse. It was a room that smelled of floor wax and old decisions, panelled in dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. The benches were hard, and the air was thick with the dust of 1,000 legal battles. I sat with my back straight, feeling the eyes of the few reporters who had managed to squeeze in. They were not just here to report on a property deed. They were here to see if the villain from the television was as cold as she looked. Evan Carr stood up to deliver his opening remarks. He stuck to the script that had worked so well on the evening news. He painted a picture of me as a vindictive matriarch, using a complex financial trust to strip a grieving widow of her only home. He spoke of the emotional toll this was taking on Lydia, repeating the phrase cruel and unusual punishment as if he were auditioning for a movie. Lydia sat beside him, head bowed, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. I watched her hands. They were trembling, but I knew it was not from grief. It was from the adrenaline of the gamble she was taking. Judge Jenkins sat behind the high bench. She was a black woman in her 60s, with eyes that looked like they could cut glass. She listened to Evan drone on, her face completely unreadable. When he began to repeat his point about my lack of empathy for the third time, she held up a hand. She turned her gaze to my table and asked Caroline in a dry, flat voice if she had anything to add. Caroline stood up. She did not use flowery language. She simply placed the Holt family trust documents and the county records on the judge's desk. She explained the structure of the trust and proved that the title to the Maple Terrace property had been held by the trust for over 12 years. She pointed out that Daniel never had the legal authority to sign that deed, making the document Lydia held legally void. Judge Jenkins took less than 5 minutes to review the papers. She looked up and banged her gavel once. She ruled that the claim of ownership by Lydia Holt was dismissed with prejudice. She stated clearly that the property belonged to the trust and Lydia had no standing. Lydia looked as if she had been slapped. Her head snapped toward Evan, and I saw her whisper something furious. Evan stammered, shuffling his papers, mumbling that his client had not provided him with those specific details. A ripple of whispers went through the room, and the sound of pens scratching on notepads filled the air. Caroline remained standing. She asked the court for permission to read certain facts into the record regarding motive, noting that the district attorney had cleared the release of this information. Judge Jenkins nodded. Caroline began to read. She listed the gambling debts. She detailed the $200,000 owed to offshore casinos. She read the text messages from the loan shark known as Hawkline Capital, which threatened physical violence if payment was not made by the end of the month. Then, she held up the certified copies of the divorce petition and the new will Daniel had signed before he died. She announced that Daniel had initiated proceedings to end the marriage and had disinherited his wife completely. the narrative of the happy couple torn apart by tragedy, which Lydia had sold to the press, evaporated in an instant. Lydia shot to her feet. She screamed that it was a lie. She yelled that we had forged the documents. Judge Jenkins banged her gavel loud enough to make the room jump. She pointed a finger at Lydia and ordered her to sit down. She warned her that accusing officers of the court of forgery was a serious allegation, and that perjury charges were already a very real possibility given the forged deed she had tried to submit. She told Lydia to be very careful about what she said next. Caroline delivered the final blow. She submitted a summary of the amended autopsy report. She did not go into the gory details. She simply stated for the record that the medical examiner had determined Daniel Holt did not die from stress or natural causes. He died from a lethal combination of non-prescribed pharmacological agents introduced into his system over a period of weeks. The hearing ended in stunned silence. As the bailiff called for all rise, the reporters practically tripped over themselves to get to the hallway. I stood up slowly. Lydia was trying to shield her face with her purse as she hurried toward the side exit. For a brief second, she looked back. Our eyes met. The arrogance was gone. The contempt was gone. All that was left was the pure, unadulterated panic of a woman who realized the trap had snapped shut, and she was the one inside it. The first hearing in the case of the state of Ohio versus Lydia Holt for first-degree murder with financial intent took place in the main criminal courtroom. It was a cavernous space filled with the murmur of the press, the public, and a few of Daniel's old colleagues who sat in the back row with grim faces. The air was heavy, charged with the static of a storm about to break. I sat in the front row next to Caroline, my hands folded in my lap, watching the back of Lydia's head. The prosecutor presented the timeline of events like a row of falling dominoes. He started with the gambling addiction and the spiraling debts. He moved to the violent threats from Hawkline Capital. Then he introduced the discovery of the divorce papers and the new will, followed by the amateur forgery of the house deed. Finally, he described the systematic poisoning that conveniently culminated right when Daniel was due for a salary increase and his stock options were set to vest. Lydia's new defense attorney tried to paint a picture of a wife in panic. He argued that Daniel was a fitness obsessive who had carelessly overdosed on dangerous supplements to enhance his performance. He claimed my son did this to himself. But then Jonah was called to the stand. He projected a digital purchase history onto the court screens. It showed that the specific heart medication and anticoagulants found in Daniel's system were ordered online using Lydia's account and shipped to a P.O. box registered in her name. Dr. Rosen testified next. She explained the mechanism of the drugs with terrifying calm. She described how the toxins built up over time, weakening the heart while thinning the blood. When the defense attorney tried to confuse the jury with talk of medical margins of error, Dr. Rosen shut him down with a single, icy sentence. She stated that the levels found in the victim were not accidental. They were predatory. Then came the final blow. The prosecutor produced a USB drive. It contained a video file recovered from Daniel's cloud account. He had recorded it on his phone in the parking garage just hours before he died, intending to send it to his lawyer. But the upload had failed until the police accessed the device. The courtroom went dead silent as Daniel's voice filled the space. He sounded weak and his breath was short, but his words were clear. He looked into the camera, wearing the same suit he had died in, and spoke to me. He said, "Mum, if you are watching this, I am sorry for letting things go this far." He continued, If something happens to me tonight, look at Lydia's accounts and check what she has been putting in my drinks. I gripped the wooden bench until my fingers ached to keep from sobbing aloud. Lydia screamed from the defense table. She yelled that he was joking and that it was a sick prank. But Jonah had already provided the parking lot security footage that matched the timestamp. In the background of Daniel's video, you could see Lydia walking toward the car, holding a shaker bottle, checking her surroundings with the paranoia of someone with a guilty conscience. The judge did not issue a sentence that day, but his ruling on her status was immediate. He declared that due to the overwhelming initial evidence and the high risk of flight, Lydia Holt was to be remanded into custody without bail. As the bailiffs moved to cuff her, she twisted around in her chair. Her face was contorted with ugly, raw hatred. She looked straight at me and shrieked that I had destroyed her life. I stood up. I did not shout. I spoke just loud enough for her to hear me over the noise of the courtroom. I told her that she had burned her life down with her own greed. I told her that all I did was turn on the lights so everyone could see the ashes. Our eyes met for one last second, and then the officers dragged her through the side door. Outside, on the stone steps of the courthouse, the winter wind felt sharp and clean. Caroline and Jonah stood beside me as the reporters swarmed. One of them thrust a microphone in my face and asked if I felt victorious. I shook my head. I told them that no one wins when a life is lost. But I said that today, at least. The truth was no longer buried under a pile of money and fake tears. As I walked toward the car, a new thought took root in my mind. I decided that I would take the assets Daniel left behind, along with the resources of the Holt Family Trust, and I would build something new. I would start a foundation in his name to help older workers learn new trades, so that no mother would ever have to stand alone against a storm like I did. For the first time since the promotion party, the block of ice in my chest cracked. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start. I was going to take this pain and do the thing Daniel was most proud of. I was going to rebuild from the rubble. Thanks so much for listening to my story, everyone. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country and let me know what you would have done if you were in my shoes. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Grandma's Family Diary, hitting that like button, and smashing the hype button to help this story get recommended to more people.